All right, Neil, thank you very much for the introduction. Everybody, I want to welcome you here to our second installation of our software-defined data center series. This topic today is on FlexPod. This is the premier platform for the software-defined data center. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Dan Barber, and he can tell us why FlexPod is the best platform. Dan?
Thanks, Adam. Good to be with you guys today. My name is Dan Barber. I am a solution architect with NetApp covering our converged systems platforms. And I want to talk to you a little bit today about FlexPod, and here's how it's going to go. We'll run through kind of how FlexPod is doing in the market. We'll talk about what is FlexPod and how do you manage it? How is it supported? So we'll run through those kind of brief points. It's a good overview. We won't get into too many details today, but we'll provide you a good introduction to FlexPod, especially if you haven't looked at it in a while. So FlexPod is, depending on how you want to measure it, is the leader in converged infrastructure by some metrics, at least in terms of our ONTAP systems. So today we have 8,700 FlexPod customers and over 160 validated architectures lifetime. And that is by far the most validated architectures of any converged infrastructure out there. And we'll talk about what a validated architecture is. FlexPod itself is a partnership, of course, between NetApp and Cisco, and this partnership has been going on since 2010, shortly after Cisco released their server offering called UCS. And when UCS was released, we entered into a partnership with them to bring together kind of a best of breed converged platform with storage, compute, and networking. And we've been doing that since 2010. And one of the things you can see even from these metrics that we have over 250 plus person years of engineering. And if you just want to do the simple math on that, that's about an average of 35 full-time employees between our two companies that are just dedicated to quality assurance, design, development, regression testing, all of the things that go into putting together validated designs between our two companies. So quite an investment by both companies. We think the strongest partnership out there that Cisco has today with any of their data center partners. And just kind of the latest metrics of where we are in the market, 5 successive quarters of double-digit growth. And that is from IDC. So this IDC measures actual shipments, not just any kind of other intangibles that are out there, but actual shipments over the last 5 quarters. You can see that FlexPod has been fairly dominant and represents a particular uptick in a market that has been trending downward as things like hyperconverged have picked up speed, that we are continuing to grow even beyond those growth rates. Reason we're doing so well, part of it is because a lot of our FlexPods today going out the door have all flash components. So if you are looking to build out or refresh a data center environment, you, of course, are probably looking at an all-flash array. And that's because that's just where the R&D is now, right? We know from most of our manufacturers, Samsung, Hitachi, Seagate, Western Digital, et cetera, that, the 10K spinning drive roadmaps are kind of at an end, and everything's going to either kind of be SATA, your 7,200 RPM disks, or it's going to be all flash. And the all flash components are a significant uptick, and the reason why FlexPod is doing so well. It delivers its value right out of the gate. And besides that, and just from a NetApp perspective, right, NetApp is a leader in delivering all flash solutions. So you can kind of see where we're at. we have a tremendous install base with FlexPod, even when it comes to all flash. And so, whether you're a small business, a large enterprise, a global, a service provider, healthcare, we have customers, referenceable customers with FlexPod using the very solutions that you're looking at. And that really just gives you kind of assurance that you're adopting a mature solution that's not going to backfire on you after you try and implement it. A couple other things that are going on. SAN is growing very fast in FlexPod. So our attach rates for new FlexPods going out the door show very high, greater than 50% attach rates for fiber channel. And that's just something that's changed in the market over the last couple of years. And you can see just how fast we're growing there, and just how much everything is changing. So fiber channels really taken off. I think some of this has been the introduction of additional form factors with 16 gig and 32 gig now coming out, also in preparation for NVMe over fabrics, which is a hot topic that we can always discuss at a later time, but it's coming forth, right? And just how fast we're getting there from a revenue perspective, right? A lot of growth in the SAN market for FlexPod. So let's talk about what FlexPod is. FlexPod, as I mentioned, is a best-of-breed pre-validated platform built on Cisco UCS, Cisco Nexus switching, and NetApp storage. And those are the three components that are required for just about every FlexPod. We'll talk about one exception here in a minute. But every FlexPod that we have out there is based on those three components. Now, what's great about a FlexPod is that it's not a fixed architecture; it's a reference architecture. And so, in a reference architecture, you can scale the components individually as you need to. If you need a higher compute density and less storage, right? For example, for VDI. Then we can certainly accommodate that. If you need very low compute requirements and a high amount of capacity or performance in your storage, et cetera. If you need to do dev test in the same pod, or if you ever wanted to do it in the same pod, right? We can enable that. And the great thing about FlexPod is you can grow in any direction with those components too. So if you start off small in compute and you grow to be large in compute, you have to go back through and recertify or anything like that. You just grow it as you would normally grow any other environment, but you do so with the confidence that because you're deploying a reference architecture, as you do it, you're continuing to use the best practices from both of our companies. And so that's a little bit about how FlexPod works. Now, I mentioned that we've already done some work for you that this is pre-validated. And how that works is we spend, it's a several month process each time we release a validated design, which is what it's called. In these design guides, we start off by going out and saying, okay, well, here's how a highly available, highly performant, fully serviceable design would look in a data center today. And we take that design and we put it down to paper. So that you can replicate that design in your own data center, or partners like AGI can do it with you. And you take that design and you go through and you can see step by step all the way from how to configure a network port, right, with the appropriate spanning tree configuration. So we go all the way through from end to end so that you can see exactly how everything should be set up, and that gives you confidence, especially if there's an area where you're not particularly sure. And what that does ultimately is reduce the risk of adopting the solution. And this is one of the reasons we have had such a high rate of adoption among our customers, is because it is a pre-validated architecture, right? It takes all the risk out of it for you. Beyond that, we have sizing guidance and other things. So I'll give you an example. Here's a recent CVD, a Cisco validated design for VMware Horizon based on 5,000 desktops. Does that mean you have to deploy 5,000 desktops? Of course not. What it means is we show you how exactly we got to the 5,000 using a reference architecture, right? So in this case, we found that we got with the particular Windows 10 image that we were using and the optimizations that we applied to that Windows 10 image, we were able to get about 210 virtual desktops per Cisco blade with a certain configuration. And so you can use that as a baseline for your 500 desktop deployment, right? And so you can take the environment and use it and say, okay, well, I would expect that if I run a similar configuration at a smaller scale, I would get similar results, or at a larger scale. And that's the power of the validated design when it comes to performance and sizing. It gives you kind of an expectation. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation where you had to deploy a new application, especially something like virtual desktops. I know I've done this myself where you weren't exactly sure what to expect, right? And you get out there and you're like, I'm not getting as many users per server as I thought I was going to get, right? And this is exactly what the Cisco validated design process is designed to prevent, or at least to mitigate to some extent, so that you can have confidence in adopting the solution that it's been architected properly. So that's a little bit about validated designs and the FlexPod itself, the components behind that. As I mentioned, you can kind of mix and match different platforms within those each of those product families, right? So you could have Nexus 5Ks or you could have Nexus 9Ks, for example. You could have an all-flash controller. You could have a hybrid controller. You could use ONTAP, or you could use our Element OS, or you could use our E-Series product, right? And all of these can be combined together. We kind of break them out into different families, kind of for different uses within businesses. So FlexPod Express is typically built on our entry-level platforms, either our E-Series platform, which is just kind of performant and reliable, doesn't have any data efficiencies or anything like that, just kind of a very simple, easy to use storage array, or our FAS like 2650 or an A200 even, our low-end entry-level platforms, combined with usually a couple of C-Series rack servers or even a UCS Mini. And I mentioned there was one case where you didn't have to have Nexus switches necessarily, and that's with FlexPod Express. So a great way to think about this is if you use a UCS Mini, which has the Cisco Fabric interconnects directly into the back of the chassis, you can direct connect your NetApp storage into that chassis. And the idea behind that is you might be at a small location that doesn't have 10 gig switching, right? But you want to connect the storage to the, typically a virtualization layer, and you want to do that very fast, usually over 10 gig, and that's why we allow the direct connection for that architecture. But all the other architectures require 10 gig Nexus switching. FlexPod Data Center is typically the core product line that our customers employ from a reference design perspective. That's your mixed workloads, enterprise applications, right? Mix of virtualization, bare metal, et cetera, right? That's kind of how all of those are put together. So most of our customers, the majority would be on FlexPod Data Center for their core infrastructure. Typically, I'll show you this in a second as well, but our application and enterprise applications like the VMware Horizon design that I just mentioned, those are typically based upon a previous FlexPod Data Center validated design, right? Because that's where it typically runs in the data center. FlexPod Select is a purpose-built solution for dedicated workloads. So think big data and analytics, right? These are the typical targets for dedicated workloads. Usually you're running that on dedicated infrastructure anyway, right? They're not being shared out with other things, and that's why we call it FlexPod Select. And then lastly, in our newest member is FlexPod SF, which is based on our Element OS product. We bought a company a couple of years ago, and they have kind of a different approach to how to consume storage. And I'll talk just briefly about that here in just a second. But that's kind of our portfolio there. I'm going to dive into FlexPod SF just for a couple of slides, explain how it's a little bit different, and then we'll come back together. So FlexPod SF is a different storage concept, right? So instead of having a typical monolithic array, which is what we call it when you have a dual controller pair with a bunch of disks behind it, right? That's kind of your typical storage array. FlexPod SF is based on a completely shared nothing scale out architecture, right? So each individual storage node owns its own disks and doesn't share those with any other nodes in the cluster. And so you put together, say, a minimum of 4 nodes. These are built on Cisco C220 M4s. And we put those together into a clustered system that has global deduplication, global compression, and it acts as a linear scaling device, right? So every time you add a node, you get the same amount of capacity, the same amount of performance, linearly scaled out within the cluster. Think about, I like to talk about FlexPod SF as using and consuming storage the way you consume your servers. If you think about it from that mindset, if you've always said, man, I really wish my storage acted a lot like my server infrastructure, right? If it was that kind of that easy to use, it operated in the same way, right? That's a good way for you to think about, hey, is this the right product for me? That's a good kind of diagnostic question for you to think about. The other thing that we do in FlexPod SF that is a little bit different is we have what we call a performance guarantee. That is that each node is rated for a certain amount of 4K IOPS. So in this case, 75,000 4K IOPS. So when you actually provision a volume, you're actually reserving performance capacity for that volume. So that even under failure, you're guaranteeing that the performance is available to each particular application that you require. So think about it as an SLA for your data, right? A way for you to guarantee that your workloads are never starved for the performance that they need. And so that's FlexPod SF. I mentioned it is a minimum 4-node cluster. So again, this is a little bit different than traditional ONTAP. It is iSCSI only, but again, if you are looking for a multi-protocol box, then typically you're going to go back to FlexPod Data Center, right? Where we can do NFS, FCOE, fiber channel, and CIFS, right, all together. And future protocols, will be enabled through that same platform, right? So that's a little bit about FlexPod SF. And where it's utilized. So beyond that, we take these core infrastructure workloads, right? These core platforms, and we build out a series of Cisco validated designs, and we also call them NetApp verified architectures, or NVAs. And we use that to build out particular workloads on top of them. So I mentioned like, VDI is one of those, Zen Desktop, Exchange, SharePoint. Cisco ACI, if you are looking at Cisco ACI or doing any kind of microsegmentation and network security, software-defined networking, FlexPod is definitely the platform of choice. We're already ready to go from an infrastructure perspective with both of those solutions. And you'll see that we will have regular updates with the typical infrastructure products. So We have, had the regular updates with vSphere 6.0, 6.5, etc. Soon to be 6.7, right, as that comes around, and we get into the life cycle of that release. Same thing with Windows and Hyper-V, right? So we already have Hyper-V in Windows 2016. When the next release comes out, right, we'll have an iterative update for that. Beyond that, then we add in additional workloads, okay? So Oracle, SAP, Docker, et cetera, right? And we continue to add those and layer them on top. And that's how we're able to have so many different validated designs. It's a lot of work, don't get me wrong. It's a lot of work to put them all together. And we've spent a lot of time on this. And you saw at the beginning kind of our investment from a personnel perspective is pretty substantial, even in and of itself. So that's a little bit about FlexPod and those designs. I have a couple I'll share about just briefly, just kind of to highlight a few of these in a little bit of detail. And then we'll turn our attention to FlexPod management. So one of the ones we released last year was our full end-to-end 40 gigabit Ethernet CVD. Also happened to include 16 gig fiber channel, which this is a great example of how you can run both at the same time, right? Even if you wanted to run it from a storage perspective, right? You could put out NFS on 40 gig and do 16 gig fiber channel at the same time if you wanted to. So again, there's an option there to do that. We did include support for the MDS, 16 gig fiber channel MDS switch. We also have support now for 32 gig. So that's out there. I mentioned Docker Data Center, right? We have Docker Data Center support through our Trident plugin. If you have not looked at Trident and you're looking at any kind of a DevOps workload, whether it's with Docker or Kubernetes, give Trident a look. Trident can deploy and automate through our APIs, can deploy storage across multiple platforms. So even if you're deploying in the cloud, we have ONTAP products in the cloud. I'll talk about those in a second. You could deploy seamlessly in the cloud and on-prem through a single interface. Really, really cool, very efficient. Developers love it because they only have to go one place to deploy anywhere. From a security perspective, I already mentioned ACI. We also have what we call workflow automation. Workflow automation is a command line tool that we use to automate deployment in ACI data centers. So we can go out and actually communicate with ACI and help it to provision those network ports as required in the ACI fabric. I mentioned the Horizon one. Again, I told you the 210 VMs per blade. You can kind of see, again, this goes out and gives you an idea of what is a reference architecture for a VDI environment look like. And maybe I want to take a few blades and dedicate those to my VDI environment, and I can have a few more blades in the same chassis work in my virtual server environment. That's the great thing about FlexPod, right? You can add individual components as you need them, and you have the same shared architecture, which gives you really efficient use of your resources in your data center. 3D visualization. So this is really big in healthcare, engineering, oil and gas. We can actually do remote 4K streaming and do it very, very efficiently. We even have demos of this available for you guys if it comes, if you want to see what it looks like. But really, really hard, really proud of this in our partnership with NVIDIA to be able to present this in some of the most, frankly, demanding applications, but being able to visualize them right in remote locations is often very difficult. And we've worked really hard on this solution, so I think you'll like it. OpenStack and our partnership with Red Hat goes back many years, very, very many years. But just from a deployment of OpenStack, we partnered with Red Hat and a service provider, a software as a service provider called Platform 9 to deploy OpenStack. It'll actually put down all of the OpenStack components for you from the cloud and do it very, very quickly. We are part of the OpenStack Alliance. We've contributed a lot of code to the OpenStack Alliance, and you'll find all that out there, information out there on GitHub and places like that. If you're in the healthcare space, right, whether it's Epic or Cerner or Meditech or anyone else like that, right, FlexPod is a great solution for eliminating risk. Nobody wants to take risk when it comes to patient records, which is why we have a lot of FlexPods in healthcare environments. And the fact that they're easy to scale out, right, for different use cases, right, when you put all your images down, maybe you don't want all those on all flash, right, because they don't compress and they're oftentimes cold data. On the other hand, maybe you want to run some data analytics against it on a, some kind of an analytics cluster, and you want to start comparing, say patient MRIs, or patient records to find correlations that you never really looked at before, right? Well, that's a great case to take stuff like that and put it on your all flash array, right? So it gives you flexibility to change the environment and utilize it as the business requires it. So the last one I'll talk about is not specific to any one particular application or vertical, but the fact that what we've done at NetApp is try to enable us to be a hybrid cloud company, right? If you look at Gartner, IDC, Forrester, right, all of the industry analysts out there, and you don't even have to look that far. You can just look at AWS and their numbers, right? The fact of the matter is the future is hybrid cloud, right? And it's not just one cloud, it's a lot of clouds. Customers are looking to, how do I get into cloud first? And once I'm there, how do I keep it from not costing me a fortune, right? And how do I manage my data there in a way that I can, functionally equivalent to the way I manage it on-prem? And this is a question that NetApp has sought to answer for the last 6 years. We've kind of been on this cloud journey. And we've done that with what we call the data fabric. The data fabric is just our way of saying, put your data where you need it. If it's on premises, put it in a FlexPod. If it's in the cloud, put it on NetApp private storage, maybe co-located in the Equinix data center. Or maybe put it up in the cloud using ONTAP Cloud or something like Cloud Volumes, which is a native first-party service from Azure and AWS. And use your data where you need it to be, and then be able to move your data around as you need it, right? So if I need to do development data in AWS, but then I want to run in production back in my own data centers, or vice versa, I can do that without having to reinvent the wheel, right? I could just sync data between those two sites. That's the power of the data fabric. And FlexPod is a huge part of that, right? It's our platform of choice inside when you're on premises in your data center. We do have integration with Cisco Cloud Center, right? Cisco Cloud Center itself is designed for the hybrid cloud storage model, where you develop an application blueprint, and that blueprint can deploy to multiple sites. One of those sites typically being on-prem, another one being any number of cloud providers. So kind of a write once, deploy many scenario. That's what Cloud Center provides, and Cloud Center can orchestrate that data movement, right, between on-prem or in the cloud, or between multiple clouds, right? Again, that's part of the value that NetApp brings to the data management story. So that's a little bit about FlexPod and our designs, our functionality. Let's talk about management. So FlexPod management is done a couple of ways. One is using the native tools, right, from Cisco and NetApp. Those can be UCS Manager, UCS Director, DCNM for SAN, ONTAP System Manager, Command Unified Manager, right? All of these different ways that you can use your different individual tools to manage each component. If, however, you would like to have kind of a central location to manage all of that stuff, you can use Converge Systems Advisor. Converge Systems Advisor is a product that's been around for a couple of years. It was a company that we, again, acquired last year and have kind of rebranded it as Converge Systems Advisor. And the way it works is we install a small OVA right into your data center that goes out and pulls information via API from each of the three components, Nexus, UCS, and NetApp, and then aggregates that data, sends it up via HTTPS to the same place where your NetApp auto supports go, now called ActiveIQ, and sends it to that same secure location. And then we use that to provide a cloud-based portal for you as the customer to log into, and you can see all of your particular components. And it gives you a list, and you'll notice this looks a lot like the same layout diagram as you saw in your Cisco validated design. And of course, that's not a coincidence, right? But you can see how your system is cabled up and configured, right? Do I have any errors in the system? Are there anything that I need to be alerted to? Am I following all of my best practices? So you can think about Converge Systems Advisor as providing continuous validation that your FlexPod is in optimal health, in that it's not experiencing any problems or anything like that. Now, it doesn't go as far, like it's not a full performance monitoring solution. This is configuration monitoring and management at this point. So again, get a graphical view. I can drill down from this page into any of those devices. I can go through and see which rules itself are being are not in compliance with best practices based on what rule it's looking at. So, for example, if I don't have redundant links from one component to another, or if those are configured properly in a virtual port channel, et cetera, et cetera. And I can go through and see those validations. We have over 300 individual checkpoints for our best practices in a typical FlexPod. And so this automates the discovery of those in mapping whether or not they're doing. It'll even check for things like if you cabled controller A to switch A and you meant to cable a controller A to switch B, for example. It'll even check for things like that to make sure that your connections are redundant in the case of a failure. So again, continuous validation. We'll send all that information out to you via automated reports, or you can go in and run the report on demand anytime as necessary, right? These reports are great to send up to management to say, hey, I'm running on the latest firmware. All that firmware checks out is validated, and it's all on the qualified list. Or if you need to go in and do an asset management report, right? And you just print off a report that says, here's all my assets, here's all my serial numbers, hand it over to your asset guys or gals, as the case may be, and away you go, right? So really great package, very low cost of entry on this. So really a tool that we highly recommend. It really makes managing your FlexPod much simpler in the end. Lastly, we'll talk about support. So FlexPod support, this is one of the hallmarks of using a reference architecture, right? One of the great benefits of doing this is that you get a phenomenal support experience. And the reason for that is since we have done so much hard work to go out and do all the testing and the value and all the intercompany cooperation, right, that has to happen when you put together a solution like this. Because we've done all that, we were able to go back to the ISVs like VMware, Citrix, Microsoft, Red Hat, and say, hey, since we've done all this hard work, how about you all sign off on the solution as well and say, hey, if somebody's running a FlexPod and they have a problem with your software, your kind of your normal software, I'll talk about what that is. How about you don't give them the typical runaround? like, hey, have you tried to reboot this? Or hey, have you tried to do this? And how about we get them to a level 2 support team right out of the gate? And we were able to get those companies to agree to that. So if you are running hypervisors from VMware, Microsoft, or Red Hat, for example, right, and you happen to call up, say, VMware, and you say, hey, I've got a problem with my vSphere 6.5. I'm running it on a FlexPod. VMware then at that point will go through and will say, okay, you're running on a FlexPod. I know it's probably not going to be a problem with a particular driver unless it's a bug that nobody else has found before, right, or something like that. But typically that doesn't happen because we've already gone out and done all the testing for you. And so they say, so, it gets you out of kind of the rigmarole of the entry level troubleshooting, right? All the experiences that we've all had, and get you to a team that understands, hey, these guys are running on a validated architecture. Let's really try and solve the problem. Now, beyond that, we also have a cooperative agreement, as why we call it cooperative support. We have a cooperative agreement with each of these vendors where we can initiate warm handoffs of support cases to each of them if we determine that the problem isn't where we originally thought it was. So if you happen to call VMware and VMware says, hey, we really need to get NetApp involved in this, right? Then they can initiate a process to us on the back end and say, hey, let's get you guys involved on this. Here's how we've worked it so far. Here's how you guys can work it so far, and let's figure out how to solve this together. That's the power of using a reference architecture, right? You don't get any of the finger pointing between the companies that say, no, it's your problem, no, it's your problem. And in the end, you end up just waiting 2 months and nobody ends up solving the problem, right? That doesn't happen in a FlexPod environment. And again, that's where the power of the system has come for a lot of our customers. So we support, as I mentioned, all of the hypervisors. So the light blue that you see there are available as a part of our standard support. In addition to that, VDI from Citrix and VMware is also covered. Now, beyond that, if you want to go into specialized products, so if you want to get support for, say, other Citrix products or other VMware products or SAP or Oracle, we can provide those also through an additional support uplift called Cisco Solution Support. And that solution support is an additional above and beyond regular support, but gives you kind of a one-stop access for all of your applications. It could just be for FlexPod if you want Cisco to manage your case from creation to close, then you can use just FlexPod solution support without any other applications added on. Or you can add Cisco solution support for those additional applications as well and just call Cisco for everything. If you choose to get solution support, you don't have to call Cisco all the time if you don't want to. You could still call NetApp or you could still call VMware even if you wanted to. So again, flexibility of how you want to choose your support experience. Again, that's part of FlexPod. We're not going to lock you into doing any particular solution. Do what's best for your business as you see fit. So that's a little bit about FlexPod and FlexPod support. We have a number of customer references that we can provide. Again, there'll be a couple listed in this support deck. I won't go through them all now, but that's all I had today for you guys. I'll turn it back over to Adam and Neil.
All right, Dan, thank you very, very much. That was an excellent presentation.
You're welcome.
I did see a couple of questions come in, though. If you've got maybe another 2 or 3 minutes to answer 1 or 2 of these.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, the first one we got here was asking if we could explain the difference between converged and hyper-converged infrastructure.
Sure. So converged and hyper-converged. So a couple of things. And, it's kind of like sometimes talking to a doctor and you say, my arm hurts. And, one doctor says, well, maybe it's your muscle. And the other doctor says, maybe it's your bone. And so to clarify a couple of terms first, converged can mean talking about the particular hardware. So for example, converged sometimes means I'm running multiple protocols along the same physical cable. So you can think about it like converged networking, right? And this is something that, say, Cisco UCS does across between the UCS chassis and the fabric interconnects, or NetApp does when it runs, FCOE on top of NFS, on top of iSCSI, et cetera, all on the same physical cable. That's converged networking. But converged infrastructure itself really speaks more to the reference architecture of the environment. Converged infrastructure then is a place where infrastructure solutions come together in terms of a reference architecture, right? So in you're able to run multiple, say, workloads on that particular reference architecture. So when we say converged infrastructure, that's typically what we mean, is that consolidated, combined, mixed workload infrastructure that's put together in a reference architecture. Beyond that, hyperconverged then itself is typically taking a step and bringing all of those independent functions, so storage and compute, most typically, sometimes networking, depending on the solution, and bringing all of those and converging them into a single physical form factor. Typically what you see, right, is the typical 2U 4-node chassis, where each individual node is running a multitude of those functions, right? That's typically what people mean by hyperconverged infrastructure. So I hope that explains the differences of the two. There's certainly a lot of challenges between both of them, right? Every design choice is a trade-off. So if you choose to have a design that's more flexible, then you add some complexity into the environment. If you choose a design that's more simple, then you add rigidity into the environment, right? It's always the design choice. And that's why you have to figure out what things are most important to you as a customer.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Dan. Let me let me pull one more out here, and then we'll
Sure.
let everybody go today. Let's see. How about this one? I guess this would probably have been a response when we were earlier talking about spinning disks starting to go away. Mm-hmm. It says, should my company be looking at an all-flash solution?
Yeah, it's a great question. All-flash solutions, right? So I mentioned a little bit about kind of the hardware roadmap, right? So today NetApp has 16 terabyte SSDs in the market. We certainly have roadmap for much larger sizes, right? And this isn't any kind of confidential information. It's the same with Samsung, for instance, right? If you look at their publicly available roadmap, they'll say, we're putting most of our R&D into solid state storage. It's much more dependable, and the capacity from a scaling standpoint, as we look to the future, we don't have the physical geometry limitations that we do of spinning disk, right? There's only so many platters you can cram in there. And there's only so many ways to redo, the cell architecture, and so many different kinds of gases you could fill the drives with before it, one, becomes impossible, and two, cost prohibitive. And so when we look to the future, we look at, say, 5 years from now, and we look at having 128 terabyte SSDs, right? As we look at that, that's going to end up becoming the new capacity layer. We all don't think about that necessarily now. SSDs is capacity, but that's the reality of where we're going, right? You think about it with your iPhone or your laptop. Most of us have technology devices that only have SSDs in them. And that's a lot of what's driving it, right? The consumer market is driving it as much as the enterprise storage market is driving it. And so eventually we'll have this, capacity SSD tier, and we'll have other protocols in front of it, right? We'll have NVMe, which will enable faster transport. And then we'll have server class memory, which is memory that sits closer to to the server CPU, right? And is able to provide even faster access. And that's going to become your new tier 0 kind of performance layer. And these 128 terabyte SSDs will end up becoming your capacity layer. So that's kind of the direction of where things are moving. Now, as to whether or not you should be looking at an all-flash array, I would say, one, it really depends on your workloads and what you're trying to get out of them. If you've got a video surveillance system that you're not planning on running any analytics on, it's hard for me to justify an all-flash solution for that because the data is just sitting there and it doesn't compress or dedupe very well. But for most mixed workload data centers, right, for most of them, all flash just provides better economics over the long run. You get a longer useful life. It consumes a lot less power, a lot less space. It just tends to be overall a better solution, which again is why so many customers are adopting it. So hopefully that helps answer the question.
All right. Thanks, Dan. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
So since we're at the top of the hour, we'll go ahead and let everybody get back to their day. I want to thank everybody very much for spending an hour with us today to learn about FlexPod, and we'll hope you'll join us next time for our next installment of our software-defined data center series. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.